Welcome to an event I'm truly excited about, an event that connects research to practice on issues that you as school leaders deeply care about. This is our first webinar of this type, and in the fall, we're planning a more extensive series.
This webinar is part of a series that's sponsored by the Wallace Foundation. It's also an extension of Digital Promise's work with the Wallace Foundation in 2021 on principal leadership in a virtual environment. Our goal with this webinar and the series is really to advance school leaders' understanding of research on current critical topics and its application to their learning environment. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Pout-Stevenson. I'm the Director of Educator Community Partnerships at Digital Promise. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. Brooke Stafford-Brizard to lead this conversation. Dr. Stafford-Brizard is Vice President for Research to Practice at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, where she leads work to support bringing inclusive and evidence-based whole child practices to learning environments. This grant portfolio supports researchers, educators, and policymakers in their efforts to bring a more holistic approach grounded in the science of learning and development to classrooms. Dr. Stafford-Brizard has also led the development of a community of hundreds of these partners, fostering unique partnerships and collaborations leading to breakthroughs and innovations in whole child practice. She regularly authors opinion pieces for outlets, most recently the 74, NBC's Parent Toolkit, and EdSurge. She also speaks regularly at a number of education conferences and has been a keynote speaker at such events as South by Southwest EDU, the Aurora Institute, which is formerly INACOL, and Fusion. So our program for today, we are going to spend about 15 minutes with a presentation from Dr. Stafford-Brizard on the research foundations and some examples in practice. Then for the next 30 minutes, you will be in breakout rooms exploring problems of practice, and then we will come back together at the end for Q&A and next steps. So Dr. Stafford-Brizard, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, and it's wonderful to be here today. I'm really thrilled and excited to be with a room full of practitioners who are focused on this topic. We're going to cover some strategies grounded in research focused on connection and well-being in the next 15 minutes. And I just want to recognize how much we could cover and how much need there is out there for these types of strategies. And how overwhelming it can be to kind of think about all the different places where we need to focus with students, with teachers, tier 1 school-wide supports, kind of tier 3 targeted supports. And so what I want to do today is kind of chunk this into 3 spaces. One, to kind of reground many of you in kind of the impact that connection and well-being has on learning, has on the brain and the body, and then really focus on the impact of the context of trauma on the brain and learning, and the role that connection and well-being can play as a buffer. And then we'll talk about some practices that a partner school, Van Ness Elementary, has been building and codifying to support students, focused on relationships, focused on connection and well-being. And then I want to focus the third part on teachers, because there is such a strong need to support our teachers right now, and just recognizing you cannot have whole children if you do not have whole teachers. And so we'll focus on that for a bit before we move into the breakout rooms. So Stephanie, you can move to the next slide. Thank you so much. I want to first ground us in the fact that, oftentimes we see kind of connection, well-being, these non-academic elements disconnected from academics, disconnected from learning. And I just want to reinforce what so many of us know, that these are inextricably linked. And our brain, our body, we evolved as a species because of social connection. The anthropologist Margaret Mead was asked what the first sign of civilization was, and she named a healed femur. That once we saw that we connected as a human society and took care of each other, we evolved and moved on as a civilization. And that is ingrained in our brains. Our cognitive processes, how we pay attention, how we hold information in memory, is deeply connected to how we feel safe in relationships. And that starts with infancy. Healthy adult attachment is the foundation of our development between that infant and a caregiver. And it moves on through life. You know, we rely on social connections and relationships to feel grounded, and that does unlock the learning centers of the brain. You can move on, Stephanie. Thank you so much for these slides. I also want to recognize the impact that that trauma has on those learning centers of the brain, because we are continuing to function in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of racial reckoning in our country that is creating spaces of adversity. And I'm pointing to research that was done in the 90s on adverse childhood experiences, which many of you have likely seen. And in that research, adversity or trauma was named in these kind of three spaces: abuse, neglect, and dysfunction or instability. And since then, this framework has been expanded. We know there are many other contexts of adversity, like bias that children and adults experience. But this first phase of research showed that these contexts of adversity impact the body and the brain. And so I think you can go to the next slide. What happens when we are experiencing adversity is stress, chronic stress, and chronic stress releases a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol is a protective hormone for us as a mammal. We recognize as a mammal, when we're feeling that type of stress, when we're in a space of adversity, that we need to focus on survival. And so we move into fight, flight, or freeze. And what that does as the cortisol is in the brain is it kind of shuts down those learning centers to make sure that we can focus on that fight, flight, or freeze and take care of ourselves as a mammal. And what that does is those higher order spaces of the brain where we do have that focus on attention, on memory, they are less active. And so you can imagine it's very hard to pay attention, to focus, to hold information in working memory as a student, as a teacher, as a human, if you're experiencing that level of stress. And you can move to the next slide. What we learned from this research and years of the research from the 90s on is the impact that these adverse childhood experiences have on outcomes through adulthood. That starts with the fact that students who experience 4 or more of these experiences of adversity are 32 times more likely to present with learning or behavior problems. Now, this is some of the research that our former Surgeon General in California, Nadine Burke-Harris, has done. And I spoke with her and kind of got that permission to move the language from more likely to have learning and behavior problems to present with, because again, we're talking about a context that impacts the child. It's not ingrained or permanent in the child or the human. And so recognizing that adversity has an impact on learning and behavior, but there are things we can do. Just noting that there are other profound outcomes connected to adverse childhood experiences, like higher rates of heart disease and cancer, higher rates of risky behavior. And these adverse childhood experiences are connected to many causes of death. And so just recognizing, we learned from this research and the years of research from it, that the context we are functioning in deeply impacts us in our body and our brain. So moving on. I want to talk about what we do in the context of that. And I want to talk about 2 things today. One is the power of connection, the power of relationships. And the second is just the power of structures and routines that create a space of safety for students and adults. Because those are 2 things that we can do as educators to recognize how to support our students and our teachers. And when we talk about connection and relationships, I want to bring us right into some powerful research on developmental relationships, right? So when we talk about relationships, often we look at this first square in the top left corner, expressing care. Critical. It is critical that we express care, we support a student in that space of relationship. But what's really important about this research and the framework that the Search Institute has developed is that there are more elements to supporting students in relationships that we have to focus on. It isn't just expressing care. It's challenging growth, right? It's sharing power. It's expanding possibilities, and it's providing support. And so it's a really complex set of supports that we need to provide for students that start with care, but also expand beyond it and give them the space to be held accountable, to hold us accountable, and to push ourselves. And so from this framework, I want to turn to some concrete practice on the next slide. And this is the school that I mentioned. Van Ness Elementary is a district school in Washington, D.C., led by Cynthia Robinson Rivers. Over the past several years, she has worked with an organization called Transcend Education, and she has codified a number of the phenomenal practices that she's done that have driven success in her building. She has pulled from many areas of research and has worked with her staff to build these. And I'm pointing to the website at the bottom, because if you go there, you'll see kind of further descriptions and implementation guides of some of the things that I'm talking about here today that are just really, really helpful and really, really clear. And so just to give you a few examples, one thing, and I mentioned this, one thing that we can do to address trauma and stress with students is create consistent, predictable routines. That is something that reinforces safety, reinforces like the expectation that no surprises are happening. And so the team at Van Ness does this in a few different ways. One is through morning routines and what they call Strong Start. And that starts with kind of a greeting, a really structured greeting, which I'm sure many of you do as school, your school leaders do it, your teachers do it, but it's consistent. And often there's choice in terms of how the students want to engage in a greeting. And that's really critical in a what we call a trauma-informed environment as well. That safety, that consistency, that predictability is key, but so is choice, because students and adults and humans need to feel like they have some control. And so that morning greeting is a really key start that the Van Ness community focuses on. But they also have other routines that kind of begin their day together. They have partnered connection. So students connect with each other and kind of have a moment one-on-one to be in relationship and to just start their day together. And then they move out and they have a broader community building activity. And that's often a dance or a movement or a song that can kind of help them feel connected and kind of spark joy to begin their day. And that's the Strong Start that they begin with. It also can include kind of breathing activities to help the students kind of move into a regulated state and prepare themselves to learn. And the teachers will also focus on certain goal setting, like how do we want to move forward with our day together? So that Strong Start is something that the Van Ness team focuses on. They also focus on relationships and connection. And so through their culture climate data, their survey data, they look to students who need more one-on-one time. And those students get 3 to 5 minutes a day with a consistent adult within the community, a teacher or another adult in the community for that check-in, for that connection, and just so that student knows like there's this one person I have in this building. And if they feel like they need more than 5 minutes, they have protocols in place to make sure the student can get more time with that person. And a third practice I want to point out is structured recess. And that's if students are having certain behavioral problems, they actually use a recess activity to bring the students into a space where they can talk through their challenge in a small group, and then play games and engage in activities that help them to think through how they might revisit that activity or that behavior and kind of work together. These are just 3 of many, many practices that the Van Ness community has developed. And that also includes practices and structures for teachers, for the adults in the building. And that's what I want to kind of end with the next slide is the fact that we have to focus on our teachers and our adults as well. You know, we are seeing, and I know you are feeling and experiencing like a significant challenge that teachers are experiencing right now. You know, over half of the teachers in America, based on a survey done early this year, are thinking of leaving their roles sooner than they had planned. And almost all teachers are naming burnout as a significant issue. And we know from research that high levels of burnout, high levels of stress, and kind of low reported ability to cope with that stress is associated with student outcomes, both academic and non-academic. And in some of this research, we also see a pretty small amount and small percentage of teachers who actually feel like they have low stress or high strategies for coping with stress. And so it's a need that we need to address for the adults in our buildings. So if we move to the next slide, one practice that we've seen really impactful is through an organization called the Center for Healthy Minds. And this is just one practice, and it's one thing that we can do. It's not obviously like a comprehensive solution, but their team within a team they have in the Center for Healthy Minds called the Healthy Minds Institute has developed an app that focuses on supporting healthy well-being. And that is grounded in a framework that they have developed. This is a team of neuroscientists who've developed this over many years. But what does it mean to be healthy in terms of our well-being? Thinking about an asset-based lens on kind of mental well-being. And there are these 4 areas: awareness in terms of presence, self-awareness. The second is connection, which we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes or so, and that kind of feeling part of something bigger in relationship and in community. The third is insight, and really kind of like being kind of mindful of actions and behaviors that we are part of. And then the fourth is purpose, and kind of being connected to what feels very meaningful in our life. And so they took this framework, and they have a year-long, if you go to the next slide, a year-long support in this Healthy Minds app, where for each of those 4 areas, there's 3 months of supports in terms of daily meditations and practices that adults can do. And when the pandemic hit in 2020, they worked with school teachers in Madison, Wisconsin, and they adjusted it to be a 4-week program where there was a 1 week on awareness, 1 week on connection, 1 week on insight, and 1 week on purpose. And every day for about less than 15 minutes, teachers were on this kind of either walking through a seated and kind of focused meditation, or you can do one during activity. It'll walk you through if you're washing dishes or taking a walk. And through those daily kind of short activities, the Healthy Minds Institute team found significant drops in psychological distress and loneliness for teachers, and increases in mindfulness and that connection to meaning and well-being. And this was in place at the end of the 4-week intervention, and then sustained results 3 months later. And so this is just kind of one tool that we've seen effective to support teachers. Like I said, there are many more, and I hope you'll kind of visit the Van Ness, the whole child model site in particular. But we'll close with that and move to some more engaged activities in the breakout rooms.
Thank you so much for that information, Dr. Stafford-Brizard. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. As we move into our breakout rooms, you'll have an opportunity to discuss problems of practice that are relevant to your schools. We have set up a Padlet. If one of my colleagues would not mind dropping that in the chat for me. On the Padlet, when you log on, you'll see there are a series of 5 columns as prompts for you to reflect on what you've just heard. So in the first column, the question is, what did you see, or I'm sorry, what did you hear and see that resonated with you? The second column is, what resources or strategies is your district using to support well-being and connection? What are the current challenges to well-being and connection your teachers and students are facing? And then what's one idea that you could try to address your challenge? And then in the final column, we do also encourage you to post any questions that you have, because we will come back together for a short Q&A at the end of this session. And that's a great way for us to capture those questions. So the link to the Padlet is now in the chat, so make sure that you can click on that. We're going to break you into small groups, and then we will reconvene here shortly. We've been taking a look at the questions in the Padlet. Brooke, if you don't mind, maybe you could speak to a couple of them. And then if folks have additional questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat.
Yep, I see. Can we learn more about structured recess? Go right to the website, and you can find it on the drop-down menu. Again, I think, and this is a moment, I would say, because for many years we've heard teachers, school leaders, system leaders, just asking, could you please give me concrete examples of what you're talking about? And I can point to Van Ness and Transcend's work in this website. And so you can click on structured recess. You can learn more about it, and they have implementation guides, videos, and modeling of it. And I think it's just a fantastic resource. That's where I would answer that question. Let's see. How do you get buy-in across multiple schools across a whole district? Yes. I think, Van Ness is actually a very interesting example, because they've started to work through more of the District of Columbia's school system. And part of it is, it's a balance of kind of showing what it looks like, showing that it's possible. This has been developed by educators in partnership with different researchers and research partners. So being able to show what it looks like that it can happen in my school, and then show results, right? To show that they have data behind this, including the correlation to strong academic outcomes compared to other schools in the district. And so I think there's some of the things that support buy-in. But I will say, oftentimes when I present a lot of this work, if I focus on the listener and these outcomes connected to that own person's life, the importance of relationships, the importance of connection, the importance of well-being, if we're talking about stress management or self-regulation, tie it to the humans that you're talking to and their own life, because I think that's the first step in this resonating, because it's very rare that it doesn't, frankly.
I just want to keep going a little bit on that point, Brooke, about how you get buy-in. One of the things we do at Digital Promise is the League of Innovative Schools, and we have Kim Smith here with us today. And Kim, we have such amazing examples of leadership, like Susan Enfield. And I'm wondering if you could share, how Susan rallied people in her district around buy-in to this sort of concept.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have 125 districts in the League of Innovative Schools, and Susan at Highland Public Schools in Washington State, just outside of Seattle, is an example of, I love Brooke's example, because Van Ness there's school leaders across the country that are really pushing and doing really interesting and innovative kind of models, right? And introducing models, which is incredible. It's important to have a district leader who is an advocate, who is a champion, who is a believer in creating the spaces where this level of creativity can take place and really centering students. In Highline, Susan will always say, she starts every conversation, every presentation talking about Highline students being rooted in name, strength, and need. And that's the value that she frames up for the district as a whole, that everything that's being created or implemented to support students centers their name, their strength, and their need. And so I think that that balance of these opportunities at schools where school leaders and teachers are thinking about ways to support students in balance with district leaders are the ways that these practices start to fan out beyond a single school.
Thanks.
I see the question of adapting these methods to be inclusive of learning challenges. I would note that some of the strongest examples of this type of support for students I've seen have been in schools that actually are designed for students with learning differences. So this is really about kind of knowing the student and kind of how we can support them. And so I think, you know, you'll see in some of the resources I shared, but we talked about this in my breakout as well, like you have to explore what works for the child. And kind of, you know, we talked about like meditation and yoga and closing your eyes. It's not going to work for every child or every adult. And so thinking about how you adapt, both thinking about learning challenges and also thinking about cultural relevance and leveraging the strengths of the family and the community and the culture that students come from, to really think about how you can kind of build routines that reflect that and honor that and kind of support.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for being here today and for your really thoughtful engagement. Before we go, we wanted to let you know what's coming next. So the conversations that we have had here today and the questions that you've generated are going to inform a blog that will be published on the Digital Promise website. And our hope in sharing the outcomes is that the entire field learns from these discussions that we're having. Also, this webinar is the first in a series, as Jeremy mentioned at the introduction, that Digital Promise will host that will be sponsored by the Wallace Foundation, and those will be coming in fall of 22. And we will make sure that everyone who has joined us here today gets an invitation. And lastly, Kim has some information to share with us about some learning salons that you may be interested in.
Yes, we're excited to invite an opportunity for those of you who are interested in learning more about the research as well as seeing solutions such as Healthy Minds that might provide you with new ideas and new opportunities. So we're launching learning salons. This is with the Penn Graduate School of Education. This salon is on advancing mental health and trauma-informed practices. This is, we'll have a virtual experience in May, followed by an in-person experience prior to the ISTE conference in New Orleans in June. So if you're interested as a school leader, as a district leader, of coming into a room and workshopping your problem of practice with researchers, with solution providers, side by side, we're dropping the link in the chat to submit your interest in participating, and I hope to see you in May and June. Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone. Thank you again, Brooke Stafford-Brazard. Thank you to the entire Digital Promise team who helped me out with this webinar, and we hope to see you all again next time.